They laughed at her childish ink, calling them cartoon doodles, and questioning how someone with such unprofessional tattoos ever made it through basic training. But when a 4-star general walked into the room and his face went pale at the sight of her seemingly innocent designs, Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez and her supposedly meaningless body art became the key to unraveling the most dangerous intelligence breach in decades: the fluorescent lights of the veterans. Affairs office cast harsh shadows across the waiting room as Elena Vasquez shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair, acutely aware of the sideways glances from both staff and fellow veterans. Her long-sleeved blouse covered most of her tattoos, but the delicate vine pattern that crept up her neck and the small, geometric symbols visible on her hands drew constant attention and whispered comments from people who had already decided what kind of person she must be. Elena had been coming to this VA office in downtown Phoenix for 6 months now, navigating the bureaucratic maze of disability claims and benefit applications that seemed designed to wear down even the most persistent veterans. At 28, she looked younger than her years, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and an unassuming demeanor that made her blend into crowds. But it was the intricate artwork covering her arms, shoulders, and back that made her stand out in all the wrong ways in professional environments. The tattoos were beautiful, there was no denying that. Flowing vines intertwined with geometric patterns, small animals hidden among stylized flowers, and what appeared to be abstract designs that looked like something a talented art student might create during an experimental phase. To most observers, they seemed like the impulsive decisions of a young person who had fallen in love with tattoo culture without considering the long-term professional implications. The artwork was colorful, whimsical, and completely at odds with the serious conservative image that most people expected from military veterans. Vasquez Elena called the benefits counselor, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Mills, who had made her disapproval of Elena's appearance clear during previous appointments. Mrs. Mills had worked at the VA for over 15 years and prided herself on maintaining professional standards, which in her mind meant conservative dress and minimal visible tattoos. Elena's extensive body art represented everything she believed was wrong with the younger generation of veterans. Elena gathered her paperwork and followed Mrs. Mills down a corridor lined with motivational posters about veteran success stories and benefits program announcements. The walls were painted in institutional beige that seemed designed to drain energy and enthusiasm from anyone who spent too much time in the building. Other veterans sat in various offices, many of them older men from previous conflicts who carried themselves with the bearing of people who understood military tradition and protocol. "I have to ask again about your employment situation," Mrs. Mills said as they settled into her cramped office. "Have you considered that your appearance might be limiting your job prospects? Many employers in the private sector have strict policies about visible tattoos, especially ones that are so extensive and, frankly, unprofessional looking." Elena had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times since leaving the military. Well-meaning counselors, potential employers, and even family members had suggested everything from laser removal to makeup coverage to simply wearing long sleeves for the rest of her life. The assumption was always the same, that her tattoos were mistakes, youthful indiscretions that she now regretted and needed to hide in order to succeed in civilian life. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Mills," Elena replied with the patient tone she had developed through months of similar conversations. "But these tattoos have personal significance to me. They're not something I'm looking to remove or hide permanently." Mrs. Mills sighed and made a note in Elena's file, probably documenting what she perceived as another example of stubborn resistance to practical advice. The counselor had seen hundreds of veterans struggle with the transition to civilian life, and in her experience, those who refused to adapt to professional norms faced the greatest challenges finding stable employment. The truth was that Elena had been unemployed for 8 months since leaving the military, Not because of her appearance, but because the skills she had developed during her service couldn't be easily translated to civilian job descriptions. Her military occupational specialty had been listed as administrative support, a generic designation that gave no hint of the actual nature of her work or the level of clearance she had held. To potential employers, she looked like someone who had filed paperwork and answered phones for 4 years before getting heavily tattooed and developing an attitude problem. "I'm going to recommend you for the vocational rehabilitation program," Mrs. Mills continued, pulling out a thick packet. "OF forms. Maybe we can get you trained in something more suitable for someone with your, presentation challenges. There are programs for medical administration, data entry, customer service roles where appearance standards might be more flexible." Elena accepted the paperwork with a polite smile, knowing she would never follow through with applications for jobs that would waste the expertise she had spent years developing. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being counseled toward entry-level positions by someone who had no idea that Elena's administrative support role had involved analyzing intelligence from some of the most dangerous regions in the world and working with classified information that could reshape international relations. The other veterans in the waiting room represented a cross-section of military service from different eras and conflicts. There was Robert Chun, a Vietnam veteran who always wore his service cap and carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who had never really left the military mindset. Next to him sat Marcus Williams, a Gulf War veteran who worked as a security guard and often talked about the respect he commanded from his military bearing and professional appearance. Both men had made subtle comments about Elena's tattoos during previous visits, expressing the opinion that her appearance reflected poorly on all veterans and undermined the public's respect for military service. They represented the older generation of veterans who believed that military service should instill discipline and respect for traditional values, including conservative standards of personal presentation. "I don't understand kids these days," Robert had said during one of their previous encounters. "When I came back from Southeast Asia, we understood that you had to clean up and fit into society. This whole tattoo thing just makes employers think we're all undisciplined troublemakers." Elena had listened politely to these lectures, understanding that the older veterans meant well but had no context for understanding either her generation or the specific circumstances that had led to her extensive body art. They saw her tattoos as rebellion or self-expression gone wrong, not understanding that every symbol, line, and color had been carefully chosen for reasons that went far beyond personal aesthetics. The waiting room conversations often turned to employment challenges and the difficulties of translating military experience into civilian job qualifications. Most of the veterans were dealing with relatively straightforward issues: disability ratings, education benefits, or help finding work that matched their documented military specialties. Elena's situation was more complicated because her actual military experience couldn't be discussed openly or used as job qualifications without violating security protocols that remained in effect years after her discharge. Dr. James Harrison, the staff psychologist who occasionally conducted group sessions for veterans dealing with transition issues, had also weighed in on Elena's appearance during one of their individual meetings. He was a well-meaning man in his 50s who had dedicated his career to helping veterans, but his approach was rooted in conventional wisdom about professional success and social integration. "Elena, I want you to consider the psychological impact your tattoos might be having on your job search," Dr. Harrison had said during their last session. "Sometimes we unconsciously sabotage our own success because we're afraid of moving forward or because we want to maintain a connection to our military identity. Have you thought about whether these tattoos might represent a form of resistance to civilian integration?" The analysis was thoughtful and professionally delivered, but it completely missed the reality of Elena's situation. Her tattoos weren't about resistance or fear of change. They were about carrying forward a connection to experiences and people that had shaped her in ways that couldn't be explained to civilians who lacked the proper security clearances to understand the context. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena's apartment reflected the same disconnect between her public image and her actual background. The small one-bedroom unit was spartanly furnished, with military precision in its organization and cleanliness. But mixed among the standard veteran memorabilia were books on international relations, language learning materials for Arabic and Pashto, and technical manuals that seemed oddly advanced for someone whose official military record listed her as an administrative clerk. Her laptop contained carefully encrypted files and communication applications that allowed her to maintain contact with former colleagues who were still serving in various capacities around the world. These connections represented a lifeline to a professional identity that she couldn't openly discuss or leverage in her civilian job search, leaving her professionally isolated despite her extensive qualifications and experience. The financial pressure was becoming increasingly serious as her savings dwindled and her unemployment benefits approached their expiration date. Elena had been forced to take on part-time work at a local coffee shop, where her colleagues were college students and recent graduates who saw her tattoos as artistic and interesting rather than unprofessional. The irony of finding more acceptance from 20-year-old baristas than from veteran counselors wasn't lost on her. Her co-workers at the coffee shop, particularly an art student named Jessica, who was fascinated by tattoo culture, often asked about the meanings behind Elena's various designs. Elena had developed a collection of cover stories that satisfied curiosity without revealing anything significant. The vines represented growth and resilience. The geometric patterns were influenced by Islamic art she had admired during travels. And the small animals were personal totems representing different aspects of her personality. These explanations were technically true, but missed the deeper significance that made each tattoo a carefully encoded piece of her actual military experience. The coffee shop job paid barely enough to cover rent and basic expenses, representing a dramatic underutilization of skills and experience that Elena couldn't demonstrate or discuss without violating security protocols. Evening conversations with her roommate, Sarah, a nursing student who had become one of Elena's closest civilian friends, often touched on the disconnect between Elena's obvious intelligence and education and her current employment situation. Sarah couldn't understand why someone with Elena's analytical skills and attention to detail was struggling to find professional work, especially given her military background and obvious dedication to excellence in everything she attempted. "I know the job market is tough," Sarah had said during one of their late-night conversations, "but you're clearly overqualified for most of the positions you're applying for. Maybe you need to aim higher, apply for management roles or positions that require security clearances. Your military experience has to count for something more than entry-level administrative work." Elena appreciated Sarah's support and encouragement, but explaining why her actual qualifications couldn't be documented or discussed would require revealing information that remained classified years after her discharge. The security protocols that had governed her military service continued to shape her civilian life in ways that made normal career progression nearly impossible. The Veterans Affairs Office had become a weekly ritual that provided structure to Elena's job search while simultaneously reinforcing her growing sense of professional isolation. Each appointment brought the same conversations about appearance, the same recommendations for vocational training that would waste her existing expertise, and the same subtle pressure to conform to expectations that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities or potential contributions. Mrs. Mills' LATESD recommendation for medical administration training was particularly frustrating because Elena already possessed analytical and technical skills that far exceeded anything she would learn in a 6-month certificate program. But explaining why she was overqualified would require discussing work experience that officially didn't exist and capabilities that couldn't be documented through normal channels. The other veterans in the waiting room continued to represent different approaches to military transition, with most of them successfully leveraging their documented service records and conventional military experience to find civilian employment. Elena watched their progress with a mixture of admiration and envy, understanding that their straightforward career paths weren't available to her because of the classified nature of her actual military specialization. As she prepared to leave the VA office after another frustrating appointment, Elena reflected on the growing disconnect between her public identity as an underemployed veteran with questionable judgment about body art and her actual qualifications as a highly trained intelligence professional. The tattoos that everyone saw as obstacles to professional success were actually carefully encoded records of achievements and experiences that represented some of the most significant work of her life. The challenge was finding a way to bridge that gap without violating security protocols or revealing information that could compromise ongoing operations and the safety of people who were still serving in classified capacities. Elena's seemingly innocent body art carried secrets that could reshape international intelligence operations, but to everyone around her, they just looked like the impulsive decisions of a young woman who had prioritized artistic expression over professional advancement. The morning coffee rush at Desert Bloom Cafe brought its usual mix of university students, downtown office workers, and retirees who treated their daily latte as a social event. Elena moved efficiently behind the espresso machine, her movements precise and economical in a way that spoke of military training, though her co-workers interpreted it simply as natural grace under pressure. The cafe's relaxed atmosphere stood in stark contrast to the rigid professionalism of the VA office, but even here, Elena could feel the weight of assumptions and judgments about her appearance. Jessica Martinez, the art student who worked the morning shift, had become fascinated with Elena's tattoos from her first day on the job. Unlike the disapproving stares Elena received at the VA office or during job interviews, Jessica's interest was genuine appreciation for what she perceived as exceptional artistic work. She often asked Elena about specific design elements, commenting on the technical skill required to execute such detailed line work and the sophisticated color combinations that made each piece flow seamlessly into the next. "I've been studying tattoo art for my senior thesis," Jessica said during a brief lull between customers, "and your pieces are some of the most sophisticated work I've ever seen. The way those geometric patterns interact with the organic vine elements shows incredible artistic planning. Did you work with the same artist for everything, or did you collect these from different shops?" Elena smiled while steaming milk for a cappuccino, appreciating Jessica's enthusiasm while being careful not to reveal too much about the actual origins of her tattoos. "I worked with several different artists over the years. Each piece was done in different locations depending on where I was stationed. The consistency comes from having a clear vision of what I wanted the overall composition to achieve." The explanation was technically accurate, but deliberately vague about the specific circumstances that had led to each tattoo session. Elena had indeed worked with different artists, but those artists had been carefully selected individuals with security clearances, who understood that they were creating more than decorative body art. Each session had taken place in secure facilities, where the artists worked from coded specifications that translated classified information into seemingly innocent visual designs. Marcus Thompson, the cafe manager, represented a different type of judgment about Elena's appearance. As a business owner trying to maintain a professional image for his establishment, he was constantly balancing his appreciation for Elena's work ethic and customer service skills against his concerns about how her extensive tattoos might affect the cafe's reputation with more conservative customers. He had hired Elena despite his reservations, because she was clearly overqualified for the position and brought a level of competence that elevated the entire operation. "Elena, I need to talk to you about the new corporate accounts we're trying to land," Marcus said during their weekly staff meeting. "Some of the downtown law firms and financial services companies have pretty strict expectations about professional appearance. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to wear long sleeves when we're catering their events or meetings. It's not that. I personally have a problem with your tattoos, but these clients can be pretty traditional in their expectations." The request was delivered diplomatically, but Elena understood the underlying message. Her appearance was being viewed as a potential liability that needed to be managed rather than an asset that added to the cafe's character. She agreed to the accommodation because she needed the job, but each such conversation reinforced her growing sense of professional invisibility. Her actual qualifications and experience remained hidden while her appearance became the primary factor in how others evaluated her potential and worth. The coffee shops, regular customers had developed their own opinions about Elena's tattoos, ranging from admiration to disapproval, with most falling somewhere in between. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a retired psychology professor who came in every Tuesday and Thursday morning, had made several attempts to engage Elena in conversations about the psychological motivations behind extensive body modification, clearly viewing her as an interesting case study in millennial behavior and decision-making. "I've been reading about tattoo culture among young veterans," Dr. Reeves announced during one of her visits, settling into her usual corner table with a large coffee and yesterday's newspaper. "The research suggests that extensive tattooing often represents an attempt to maintain group identity after leaving military service. Do you find that your tattoos help you feel connected to your military experience?" Elena appreciated Dr. Reeves' intellectual curiosity but found these impromptu psychology sessions exhausting. The professor's analysis was based on general research about veteran behavior, rather than understanding of Elena's specific situation, leading to conclusions that were both reasonable and completely wrong. Elena's tattoos did indeed connect her to her military experience, but not in the way that conventional research would suggest, or that she could explain without violating security protocols. "I think everyone's relationship with their tattoos is pretty personal," Elena replied diplomatically while wiping down nearby tables. "For me, they represent important experiences and people who shaped my perspective. But I know that's not the same for everyone who chooses to get tattooed." The response satisfied Dr. Reeves' curiosity without revealing anything significant, but Elena could see the professor filing away her observations for some future academic discussion about veteran transition issues. The irony was that Dr. Reeves' research might actually benefit from understanding Elena's real story, but security protocols made that sharing impossible, leaving the professor to draw conclusions based on incomplete and misleading information. Downtown Phoenix Business District, where Desert Bloom Cafe was located, brought Elena into contact with a wide range of professionals who represented the corporate world she was supposedly trying to enter. Lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, and financial advisors formed the core of the cafe's daytime clientele, and Elena could observe their reactions to her appearance while serving their orders and clearing their tables. Most maintained professional politeness, but Elena had developed a keen ability to read the subtle signs of judgment and assumption that people thought they were hiding. The slight hesitation before making eye contact, the way conversations paused when she approached their tables, and the careful neutrality in their voices when placing orders all indicated that they were processing her appearance and making decisions about what kind of person she must be. Richard Hawthorne, a senior partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, had become a regular customer who seemed particularly interested in testing Elena's intelligence and education through casual conversation. He appeared to view her as an interesting puzzle, someone whose verbal skills and knowledge clearly exceeded what he expected from a heavily tattooed barista, creating cognitive dissonance that he tried to resolve through increasingly complex conversational challenges. "I was reading about the situation in Syria this morning," Richard said during one of his visits, watching Elena's reaction carefully. The geopolitical implications of the refugee crisis seem to be creating long-term instability that could affect international relations for decades. "Do you follow international news, or are you more focused on local issues?" The question was clearly designed to test whether Elena could engage with complex topics, or whether her education and interests matched Richard's preconceptions about young people with extensive tattoos. Elena recognized the test for what it was and found herself in the familiar position of having to calibrate her response to seem knowledgeable, without revealing the depth of her actual expertise in international affairs and regional conflicts. "I try to stay informed about global issues," Elena answered while preparing Richard's usual espresso. "The situation in Syria is definitely complex, with multiple actors pursuing different objectives and the humanitarian crisis affecting regional stability in ways that aren't always obvious from news coverage. The refugee displacement patterns alone have implications that extend far beyond the immediate conflict zone." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly at Elena's sophisticated analysis, clearly surprised by her command of international relations terminology and her understanding of complex geopolitical dynamics. Elena could see him reassessing his assumptions about her background and education, but she also knew that any follow-up questions would lead to areas where she couldn't provide specific details without revealing classified information. The testing conversations with Richard became a regular feature of his visits, with the lawyer gradually increasing the complexity of topics he introduced to see how Elena would respond. She found herself walking a careful line between demonstrating competence and revealing expertise that would raise questions about how a coffee shop employee had acquired such detailed knowledge of international affairs, military strategy, and intelligence analysis. Other customers had their own ways of processing the disconnect between Elena's appearance and her obvious intelligence. Sarah Chun, a financial advisor who worked in one of the downtown towers, had initially dismissed Elena as another underemployed millennial, but gradually became intrigued by her analytical thinking and attention to detail in even simple customer service interactions. "You know, Elena," Sarah said during a quiet afternoon when the cafe was nearly empty, "I've been watching how you handle things here, and you have excellent organizational skills and attention to detail. Have you ever considered a career in financial services? A lot of firms are looking for people who can think analytically and work well under pressure." The career advice was well-intentioned, but Elena knew that financial services firms would be among the least likely employers to overlook her unconventional appearance. The industry's conservative culture and emphasis on client confidence made visible tattoos a significant barrier to employment, regardless of qualifications or capabilities. More fundamentally, Elena's actual skills and experience were in areas that couldn't be leveraged in civilian financial work without extensive additional training and certification. "I appreciate the suggestion," Elena replied, refilling Sarah's coffee cup. "I'm exploring different options right now and trying to figure out the best fit for my background and interests. The transition from military to civilian careers can be pretty challenging, especially when your military experience doesn't translate directly to obvious civilian job categories." Sarah nodded sympathetically, understanding the general challenges that veterans faced but not realizing that Elena's situation was complicated by factors that went far beyond the usual difficulties of military to civilian career translation. The financial advisor's advice was based on observing Elena's professional demeanor and analytical thinking, but it didn't account for the security protocols and classification restrictions that governed Elena's actual qualifications and experience. The coffee shop's evening shift brought a different clientele. including university students who were generally more accepting of tattoo culture and alternative appearances. Elena enjoyed these interactions because they represented the first time since leaving the military that her appearance was viewed as interesting rather than problematic. The students often asked about her tattoos from genuine curiosity rather than judgment, creating opportunities for more relaxed conversations. Kevin Park, a graduate student in international relations, had become particularly interested in Elena's perspectives on global affairs after several conversations revealed her sophisticated understanding of complex geopolitical issues. Unlike the testing approach that Richard Hawthorne employed, Kevin's questions came from genuine intellectual curiosity and a desire to learn from someone who clearly had insights that exceeded what he was learning in his academic program. "I'm writing my thesis on intelligence sharing between allied nations," Kevin mentioned during one of their conversations, "and I keep running into references to operational security protocols that seem to limit how effectively information can be shared. Do you think the classification systems actually protect important information, or do they just create bureaucratic barriers that prevent effective cooperation?" The question hit uncomfortably close to Elena's actual area of expertise, forcing her to navigate between providing useful insights and avoiding any discussion that might reveal her personal experience with classification systems and intelligence protocols. She found herself in the familiar position of having valuable knowledge that couldn't be shared openly, leading to frustratingly general responses to questions where she could have provided detailed, authoritative answers. "I think classification systems probably serve important purposes in protecting sources and methods," Elena said carefully, "but they also create challenges for information sharing and coordination between different agencies and allied nations. Finding the right balance between security and effectiveness has to be one of the most difficult aspects of intelligence work." Kevin nodded thoughtfully, clearly impressed by Elena's nuanced understanding of intelligence challenges, but not realizing that her insights came from personal experience rather than academic study or general reading. Elena could see that he was filing away her comments for his thesis research, not knowing that he was receiving guidance from someone who had actually worked within the systems he was studying. The gradual development of relationships with regular customers created a parallel social structure where Elena could demonstrate aspects of her personality and capabilities that were invisible in more formal professional settings. The coffee shop environment allowed for organic conversations that revealed her education, analytical thinking, and broad knowledge base in ways that job interviews and bureaucratic appointments couldn't accommodate. However, these positive interactions also highlighted the fundamental disconnect between Elena's actual qualifications and her current employment situation. Every conversation with customers like Kevin or Sarah reinforced the reality that she was significantly underemployed but couldn't explain why she wasn't pursuing positions that matched her obvious capabilities. The security protocols that governed her military experience continued to shape her civilian life in ways that made normal career progression impossible. The contrast between her daytime interactions with business professionals and her evening conversations with university students illustrated the complex social dynamics surrounding appearance and professional judgment. The students saw her tattoos as artistic expression and were impressed by her knowledge and insights, while the business professionals viewed her appearance as a barrier to taking her seriously. Despite evidence of her intelligence and competence, Elena found herself living in multiple worlds simultaneously. The bureaucratic environment of the V office where she was seen as a problem to be solved. The professional coffee shop setting where she was valued for her work ethic, but limited by appearance. Assumptions and the informal academic discussions where her ideas were respected, but her credentials remained hidden. None of these environments allowed her to fully integrate her actual experience and qualifications with her current circumstances. The small apartment, Elena shared with Sarah became her sanctuary where she could temporarily escape the constant weight of judgment and assumption that followed her through public spaces. Here, surrounded by carefully organized belongings and the quiet hum of encrypted communications equipment, hidden among standard electronics, she could allow herself to remember who she really was beneath the layers of misunderstanding that had accumulated since her discharge from active duty. Sarah Martinez, her nursing student roommate, had unknowingly provided Elena with the first stable, civilian relationship that wasn't filtered through professional obligations or bureaucratic requirements. Their friendship had developed naturally over shared late-night study sessions, conversations about career challenges, and the gradual trust that comes from living in close proximity with someone who demonstrates consistent character and reliability. Sarah had accepted Elena's unconventional appearance without question, viewing the extensive tattoos as artistic expression rather than professional liability. "I don't understand why you're having such a hard time finding work that matches your obvious qualifications," Sarah said during one of their evening conversations, looking up from her medical textbooks while Elena worked on her laptop. "You clearly have advanced education and analytical skills that go way beyond what most coffee shop employees possess. Have you considered applying for positions that require security clearances? Your military background has to open some doors in government or defense contracting." The suggestion was logical and well-intentioned, but it highlighted the central irony of Elena's situation. Her military experience had indeed involved extensive work with classified information and security protocols, but the nature of that work couldn't be documented or discussed through normal channels. The positions that would best utilize her skills were precisely the ones she couldn't pursue without revealing information that remained classified years after her discharge. "Security clearance positions are complicated," Elena replied carefully, closing her laptop and joining Sarah at the kitchen table. "My military occupational specialty was listed as administrative support, which doesn't exactly open doors to high-level positions. And the clearance investigation process can be pretty intrusive, especially for people with visible tattoos who might not fit conventional expectations." The explanation contained enough truth to satisfy Sarah's curiosity while avoiding any mention of the real complications that made Elena's situation unique. Her security clearance had been at the highest levels, involving access to information that could affect international relations and ongoing operations. But documenting that clearance would require explaining the work that had justified it, creating a circular problem that had no easy solution. Elena's laptop contained carefully encrypted files that represented her lifeline to the professional identity she couldn't openly claim. Through secure communication channels, she maintained contact with former colleagues who were still serving in various capacities around the world. These conversations provided both emotional support and intellectual stimulation, allowing her to stay current with developments in her actual field of expertise while navigating the frustrating limitations of her civilian circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes, her former commanding officer, had been particularly supportive in helping Elena maintain perspective during the difficult transition to civilian life. Their encrypted conversations took place weekly, providing Elena with updates on operations and personnel changes within their former unit while offering guidance on how to navigate the unique challenges faced by veterans whose service couldn't be fully documented or discussed. "I know the transition is frustrating," Rebecca had written in her latest message, "but remember that your contributions during Operation Silent Dawn prevented what could have been a catastrophic intelligence failure. The tattoos you received in recognition of that work represent achievements that most people could never understand or appreciate. Don't let civilian ignorance make you forget the significance of what you accomplished." Operation Silent Dawn had been Elena's most significant assignment, involving deep cover work in a region where traditional intelligence gathering had failed repeatedly. The mission had required her to blend into local populations for extended periods, developing sources and gathering information that had ultimately prevented a terrorist attack on Allied forces. The success of the operation had been recognized through traditional military decorations that remained classified, but also through the carefully coded tattoos that served as permanent records of her achievements. Each tattoo represented specific aspects of her service that couldn't be documented through conventional military records. The flowing vine pattern that crept up her neck contained encoded geographic coordinates marking locations where she had conducted successful intelligence operations. The geometric patterns on her hands included symbolic representations of classified projects that had contributed to international security efforts. Even the small animals hidden among the floral designs carried meaning, representing code names for operations and personnel who had played crucial roles in her military service. The coding system used in Elena's tattoos had been developed by a specialized unit within military intelligence, designed to allow deep cover operatives to carry permanent records of their service without creating security vulnerabilities. The artwork appeared to be purely decorative to casual observers, but trained intelligence professionals could decode the symbols to verify an operative's background and qualifications. The system had been used sparingly, reserved for personnel whose cover requirements made conventional documentation impossible. Dr. James Harrison's psychological evaluation sessions at the VA office had touched on Elena's attachment to her tattoos without understanding their true significance. During their most recent appointment, he had suggested that her unwillingness to consider removal or concealment might represent resistance to civilian integration, a psychological defense mechanism that prevented her from fully accepting her transition from military to civilian identity. "Elena, I want you to consider the possibility that these tattoos serve as a form of armor," Dr. Harrison had said during their session. "They create a barrier between you and potential employers, but they also protect you from having to fully engage with civilian life. Sometimes we unconsciously sabotage our own success because change feels threatening, even when we consciously want to move forward." The analysis was thoughtful and professionally delivered, but it completely misunderstood the relationship between Elena's tattoos and her identity. Rather than representing resistance to change, the artwork served as a connection to achievements and experiences that had defined her most meaningful professional work. Removing or concealing the tattoos would feel like erasing the most significant accomplishments of her life, reducing her to the generic administrative support designation that appeared in her official military records. Elena's financial situation was becoming increasingly precarious as her savings dwindled and her part-time income barely covered basic expenses. The coffee shop wages were insufficient for long-term stability, but her unconventional appearance continued to limit her options in more lucrative employment markets. She had applied for dozens of positions that matched her actual qualifications, only to receive polite rejection letters that cited cultural fit concerns or feedback about professional presentation standards. The irony of her situation became particularly acute during job interviews where her knowledge and analytical abilities clearly impressed potential employers, only for enthusiasm to fade when they processed her appearance and made assumptions about her judgment and professionalism. Elena had developed a keen ability to recognize the moment when interviewers shifted from evaluating her qualifications to wondering whether she could be trusted to represent their organization to clients and stakeholders. Marcus Williams, the Gulf War veteran she frequently encountered at the VA office, had appointed himself as an unofficial career counselor, offering advice that reflected his own successful transition to civilian employment as a security supervisor. His perspective was shaped by his experience in finding work that valued his military bearing and traditional professional appearance, advantages that weren't available to Elena given her unconventional presentation. "The problem is that you're fighting against yourself," Marcus had said during one of their conversations in the VA waiting room. "Employers want to see that you can follow rules and fit into their corporate culture. Those tattoos send the message that you're rebellious and don't respect authority. If you want to succeed in the civilian world, you need to look like someone who can be trusted with responsibility. The advice was well-intentioned, but based on fundamental misunderstandings about both Elena's situation and the nature of her service record. Her tattoos didn't represent rebellion against authority. They were official recognition of exemplary service at the highest levels of military intelligence. The suggestion that she needed to prove her ability to follow rules and handle responsibility was particularly ironic given that her classified work had involved making decisions that affected international security and the safety of allied personnel. Elena's evening routine included carefully encrypted communications with intelligence contacts who remained active in the field, providing her with the only professional conversations where she could speak freely about her actual qualifications and experience. These discussions served multiple purposes: maintaining her knowledge of current operations, preserving her network of professional relationships, and providing emotional support from people who understood the unique challenges of transitioning from classified work to civilian employment. Captain David Kim, a former colleague who now worked in intelligence coordination at the Pentagon, had been particularly helpful in explaining the broader context of Elena's situation. Their secure communications revealed that she wasn't alone in facing employment challenges related to the classification restrictions that governed their military service, and that the military was beginning to recognize the need for better transition support for personnel whose contributions couldn't be documented through normal channels. The bureaucracy is slowly catching up to reality, David had explained in his latest message. There's growing recognition that the traditional approach to veteran employment support doesn't work for people with our background. Some experimental programs are being developed to help intelligence veterans transition without compromising security, but they're still in early stages and limited availability. The experimental programs David mentioned represented hope for Elena's long-term career prospects, but they weren't available immediately and required navigation through additional bureaucratic processes that could take months or years to complete. In the meantime, she was forced to continue managing the disconnect between her actual qualifications and her documented background, living with the daily frustration of being systematically underestimated and underemployed. Elena's relationship with Jessica Martinez at the coffee shop had evolved into genuine friendship, with the art student becoming increasingly curious about the sophisticated technical execution of Elena's tattoos. Jessica's academic study of tattoo culture had given her expertise in evaluating artistic quality and technical skill, leading to observations that came uncomfortably close to recognizing the professional nature of Elena's body art. "I've been analyzing the composition and execution of your pieces for my thesis," Jessica said during a quiet afternoon at the cafe, "and the level of technical sophistication is remarkable. The color saturation, line quality, and overall design integration suggest work by master-level artists with access to professional-grade equipment and materials. This isn't typical tattoo shop work. It looks like it was done in controlled environments by people with serious artistic credentials." Jessica's analysis was perceptive and accurate, but it raised questions that Elena couldn't answer without revealing the circumstances under which her tattoos had been created. The artwork had indeed been executed by highly skilled artists working in secure facilities with specialized equipment, but explaining that would require discussing the military intelligence context that had made such arrangements necessary. "I was fortunate to work with some exceptional artists during my travels," Elena replied diplomatically. "Military service took me to places where I could connect with people who had incredible technical skills and artistic vision. Each piece was planned carefully to ensure it would work well with the overall composition I was trying to achieve." The explanation satisfied Jessica's immediate curiosity, while avoiding any mention of the security protocols and classified requirements that had actually governed the tattoo creation process. Elena had learned to navigate these conversations carefully, providing enough information to seem forthcoming while protecting the details that couldn't be shared openly. The growing friendship with Jessica provided Elena with her first civilian relationship where her intelligence and capabilities were appreciated without reservation. The art student valued Elena's analytical thinking and attention to detail, often seeking her input on academic projects and creative decisions. These interactions reminded Elena of the professional respect she had enjoyed during her military service, before the complications of classification restrictions and appearance-based judgments had complicated her civilian transition. However, even this positive relationship highlighted the broader challenges Elena faced in building a civilian identity that honored her actual achievements and experience. Every conversation required careful calibration to avoid revealing too much while still maintaining authentic connections with people who were genuinely interested in understanding her background and perspective. The constant navigation between truth and necessary secrecy had become an exhausting feature of her daily life. Elena's apartment served as both refuge and reminder of the professional identity she couldn't openly claim. The carefully organized space reflected military precision and attention to detail, but it also contained evidence of capabilities and experience that couldn't be discussed with her roommate or displayed to potential employers. Technical manuals, language learning materials, and encrypted communication equipment represented the infrastructure of a professional life that existed in parallel to her public circumstances. The evening hours when Sarah was at clinical rotations provided Elena with privacy to engage in the secure communications and continuing education that kept her connected to her actual field of expertise. These solitary sessions represented both lifeline and torment, reminding her of the meaningful work she had left behind, while highlighting the growing gap between her current circumstances and her professional potential. As Elena prepared for sleep each night, she found herself caught between gratitude for the safety and stability of civilian life and frustration with the systematic underutilization of skills and experience that had once contributed to international security efforts. The tattoos that everyone saw as obstacles to professional success were actually records of achievements that represented the most meaningful work of her life, but that significance remained invisible to everyone around her, creating a profound sense of professional and personal isolation that grew stronger with each passing day. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The first indication that Elena's carefully managed civilian routine was about to be disrupted came through an encrypted message that arrived while she was preparing for her morning shift. The Zerkbloom Cafe. The communication appeared on her secure tablet as a seemingly innocent weather update, but the coded language immediately caught her attention and triggered protocols she hadn't used since leaving active duty. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes was requesting an urgent video conference, using priority codes that indicated a situation requiring immediate attention from personnel with Elena's specific background and expertise. Elena's hands moved automatically to secure her apartment, closing blinds and activating white noise generators that would prevent any electronic surveillance while she established the encrypted connection. The security measures had become second nature during her military service, but using them in her shared civilian apartment felt surreal, like stepping back into a professional identity that officially no longer existed. Sarah had already left for her clinical rotation, providing Elena with the privacy necessary for communications that could never be overheard or detected by unauthorized personnel. The video connection established itself through multiple relay servers and encryption layers, finally resolving into the familiar face of Lieutenant Colonel Hayes calling from what appeared to be a secure facility somewhere in the Washington, D.C. area. Rebecca's expression carried the focused intensity that Elena remembered from their most challenging operational periods. immediately conveying that this wasn't a routine check-in or career counseling session. "Elena, we have a developing situation that requires your specific expertise," Rebecca began without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone delivering a classified briefing. "Intelligence sources have identified a potential security breach involving operatives who worked in your former area of operations. The breach appears to be connected to identification protocols and recognition systems that were used during classified missions between 2019 and 2022. Elena felt her pulse quicken as she processed the implications of Rebecca's words. The time frame mentioned encompassed her most sensitive assignments, including Operation Silent Dawn and several related missions that had involved deep cover work in hostile territories. If someone had compromised the identification systems used during those operations, current personnel could be at risk, and the intelligence networks they had developed might be exposed to enemy forces. "Ma'am, are you saying that our recognition protocols have been compromised?" Elena asked, unconsciously slipping back into the formal communication patterns that had governed their military relationship. "If hostile forces have access to our identification systems, that could endanger anyone who's currently operating in those regions." Rebecca nodded grimly, confirming Elena's worst fears about the scope and seriousness of the developing crisis. "We believe someone with detailed knowledge of our coded identification systems is providing information to hostile intelligence services. The breach includes access to symbolic recognition protocols, operational area designations, and personnel identification markers that were used extensively during your deployment period." The coded identification systems Rebecca was discussing included the tattoo-based recognition protocols that Elena carried permanently on her body. If hostile forces had gained access to information about how those systems worked, Elena herself might be at risk, along with other personnel who had participated in similar programs. The artwork that seemed innocent to civilian observers could become dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands with the proper decoding information. Elena's mind began racing through the security implications and potential responses that the situation would require. Her knowledge of the identification systems was comprehensive, gained through years of operational use and training in their application under various circumstances. She understood not only how the systems worked, but also their vulnerabilities and the ways they could be compromised or exploited by hostile intelligence services. "Colonel, what kind of assistance are you requesting?" Elena asked, though she was already beginning to understand where the conversation was heading. Her expertise in the compromised systems was extensive, but accessing that knowledge would require her to resume active participation in classified operations that she had left behind when transitioning to civilian life. Rebecca's expression became even more serious as she prepared to outline the specific nature of the request being made. "Elena, we need you to participate in a damage assessment mission that will determine the extent of the breach and identify the source of the leaked information. Your knowledge of the identification systems and your experience with the operational areas involved make you uniquely qualified to assist in this investigation." The request represented a dramatic shift from Elena's current circumstances and underemployed coffee shop worker to renewed involvement in the high-stakes world of military intelligence operations. The transition felt almost impossible to process, like being asked to step from one reality into a completely different universe where her actual qualifications and experience were not only recognized but desperately needed. Elena understood that accepting the mission would mean temporary return to active duty status, with all the security protocols and operational requirements that such status entailed. Her civilian life, including her job at the cafe and her relationships with people like Sarah and Jessica, would need to be carefully managed to maintain her cover and protect operational security. The complexity of managing dual identities was daunting, But the alternative was allowing a security breach to continue that could cost lives and compromise ongoing operations. "Ma'am, what would be the scope and duration of this assignment?" Elena asked, her tactical training automatically shifting to practical considerations about how such a mission could be executed without compromising her civilian cover or creating suspicious gaps in her documented activities. Rebecca consulted notes that were clearly part of a larger operational briefing, indicating that Elena's potential involvement had been discussed at high levels within the intelligence community. Initial phase would be 2 weeks of assessment work, conducted primarily from secure facilities in the Phoenix area to minimize disruption to your current circumstances. Depending on what we discover, additional phases might be required, but we're hoping to resolve the situation quickly before it expands beyond our ability to contain it. The location specification was clearly chosen to allow Elena to maintain her civilian routine while participating in the classified investigation. Phoenix contains several military installations and intelligence facilities that could provide the secure environment necessary for such work, while allowing her to continue her cover employment and avoid questions about sudden disappearances or unexplained absences from her normal activities. Elena found herself considering the practical logistics of resuming classified work while maintaining her civilian identity. The coffee shop schedule would need to be adjusted to accommodate mission requirements, but Jessica and Marcus would likely be understanding about temporary scheduling changes. She cited family obligations or personal emergencies. Sarah would be more difficult to deceive, given their close friendship and shared living space. But nursing students often worked irregular hours that might provide cover for Elena's unusual schedule requirements. "Colonel, I need to understand the risk assessment for this mission," Elena said, her operational mindset automatically focusing on the security considerations that would govern her participation. "If the identification systems have been compromised, my own safety could be affected by resuming active involvement in intelligence operations. Are there specific threat indicators that I should be aware of?" Rebecca's expression became more concerned as she addressed Elena's security questions, clearly indicating that the risk assessment was more complex than the initial mission description had suggested. "Elena, we believe the breach is being exploited by the same network you helped identify during Operation Silent Dawn. If they have access to your identification markers, they could potentially recognize you and understand the significance of your civilian cover. We're taking extensive precautions, but there are inherent risks involved in reactivating personnel whose cover may have been compromised." The mention of the network from Operation Silent Dawn sent a chill through Elena's body as she recalled the sophisticated and dangerous organization that had been their primary target during her most challenging assignment. That group had demonstrated advanced intelligence capabilities and extensive resources, making them formidable opponents who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operations. If they had gained access to information about Elena's identity and current location, her civilian life could become a liability rather than a protection. Elena's apartment suddenly felt less like a safe haven and more like a potential target, with her daily routines and relationships becoming vulnerabilities that hostile forces could exploit. The coffee shop, her friendship with Sarah, and her regular interactions with customers and coworkers all represented potential points of contact where enemies could gather information or position themselves to threaten her safety. "Ma'am, what protective measures are being implemented for my civilian identity and associates?" Elena asked, her concern extending beyond her own safety to include the innocent people who had become part of her civilian life. Sarah, Jessica, and the other cafe employees had no idea that their friendship with Elena could potentially expose them to international intelligence threats. Rebecca's response indicated that comprehensive security planning was already underway, though the details would need to be discussed through more secure channels than their current communication link. Elena, Full protective protocols are being activated for all personnel participating in this operation. Your civilian cover and associates will be monitored and protected, though we'll need to discuss specific arrangements in person once you're cleared for active participation. The conversation was reaching the point where Elena needed to make a decision about resuming active duty and returning to the classified world that she had worked so hard to leave behind. The choice represented more than just professional opportunity. It was a fundamental decision about identity and the direction of her future. Accepting the mission meant acknowledging that her attempts to build a civilian life had been incomplete, that her true calling remained in the dangerous but meaningful work of military intelligence. Elena thought about her frustrating experiences at the VA office, where her actual qualifications were dismissed because they couldn't be documented through normal channels. She considered her underemployment at the coffee shop, where her intelligence and capabilities were appreciated but underutilized. The contrast with the current request, where her expertise was desperately needed and properly valued, highlighted the fundamental disconnect between her civilian circumstances and her actual professional potential. "Colonel, I need some time to consider the implications of resuming active duty," Elena said, though she was already leaning toward acceptance, despite the risks and complications involved. "This decision affects not just my own situation, but the people who have become part of my civilian life. I want to make sure I can protect them while fulfilling my obligations to the mission." Rebecca nodded understandingly, recognizing the complexity of Elena's situation and the legitimate concerns that needed to be addressed before she could commit to participation. "Elena, take the time you need, but understand that the situation is developing rapidly. We believe the security breach is ongoing, and each day of delay potentially exposes more personnel and operations to compromise. I need your decision within 48 hours. The deadline was reasonable given the urgency of the situation, but Elena knew that 48 hours would barely be sufficient to arrange her civilian affairs and prepare for the security protocols that would govern her renewed involvement in classified operations. The transition from coffee shop employee to active intelligence operative would require careful orchestration to avoid creating suspicious patterns or unexplained changes in her behavior. Elena's mind was already beginning to develop contingency plans for various scenarios, from complete cover maintenance to emergency extraction procedures if her civilian identity became compromised. The tactical planning came naturally after years of operational experience, but applying those skills to protect her civilian relationships and maintain her cover story felt like navigating uncharted territory, where personal and professional considerations intersected in complex ways. As the secure communication ended, and Elena began the process of returning her apartment to normal civilian configuration, she realized that the crisis represented both opportunity and threat to everything she had tried to build since leaving active duty. Success in the mission could lead to resumed intelligence career with proper recognition of her capabilities, but failure could result in complete exposure of her cover and potential endangerment of everyone who had become important to her civilian life. The next 48 hours would determine whether Elena's carefully constructed civilian identity could coexist with her true professional calling, or whether the demands of national security would force her to choose between the meaningful work that defined her capabilities and the authentic relationships that had given her hope for a different kind of future. The decision would reshape not just her own life, but potentially the lives of everyone who had unknowingly become part of her world during the months when she had tried to forget that she was anything more than an underemployed veteran with questionable judgment about body art. The news broke on a Tuesday morning while Elena was opening Desert Bloom Cafe, her hands mechanically going through the familiar routine of starting the espresso machine and arranging pastries while her mind processed the encrypted message she had received at dawn. A joint task force had been activated to investigate what intelligence officials were calling the most significant security breach in recent military history, involving the compromise of classified personnel identification systems and the potential exposure of deep cover operatives across multiple theaters of operation. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, who was already at the university reviewing news coverage for her journalism minor. "Holy shit, Elena. There's this huge story breaking about military intelligence being compromised. They're saying someone leaked information about secret identification systems that could put soldiers at risk. This is like spy movie level stuff happening in real life." The irony of receiving updates about her own classified situation through civilian news coverage wasn't lost on Elena as she watched the morning news on the cafe's television. The reports were carefully sanitized to avoid revealing operational details, but the broad outlines confirmed that the situation Rebecca had described was even more serious than their encrypted conversation had indicated. Multiple intelligence agencies were coordinating response efforts, and several allied nations had been notified about potential threats to their personnel. Marcus Thompson arrived for his morning shift with unusual energy, clearly energized by the breaking news story and its implications for national security. As a former military member himself, he understood the significance of intelligence breaches and was eager to discuss the situation with Elena, not realizing that she might have more than academic interest in the developing crisis. "This is exactly the kind of thing that makes civilians lose trust in military competence," Marcus said while reviewing the morning's inventory sheets. "If someone can compromise classified identification systems, what does that say about our ability to protect sensitive information? These intelligence failures make all veterans look bad, because people start questioning whether military training actually produces reliable, trustworthy people." Elena nodded appropriately while fighting the urge to explain that the situation was far more complex than civilian news coverage could convey. The identification systems that had been compromised represented some of the most sophisticated security measures ever developed, requiring extensive insider knowledge and access to breach effectively. The fact that someone had succeeded in penetrating those defenses suggested either a highly placed traitor or a catastrophic failure in security protocols that had taken years to develop. Dr. Patricia Reeves arrived for her usual Tuesday morning coffee with a copy of the Washington Post tucked under her arm, clearly prepared to engage in her weekly analysis of current events and their psychological implications. Elena could see that the retired psychology professor was particularly animated about the intelligence story, probably viewing it as an opportunity to discuss the psychological profiles of people who commit treason and the institutional factors that contribute to security breaches. "Elena, I've been reading about this intelligence situation, and I find myself wondering about the psychological motivations of someone who would betray classified information," Dr. Reeves announced as she settled into her corner table. "The research suggests that most intelligence breaches are committed by people who feel undervalued or overlooked by their organizations. Do you think the military's hierarchical culture might contribute to these kinds of betrayals?" The question was uncomfortable in ways that Dr. Reeves couldn't possibly understand, given Elena's own experience of feeling undervalued and overlooked since leaving military service. The irony of being asked to analyze the psychological motivations for intelligence breaches while being personally recruited for a mission to investigate exactly such a breach created cognitive dissonance that Elena struggled to manage without revealing her own involvement in the situation. "I think people's motivations for betraying classified information are probably pretty complex," Elena replied carefully while preparing Dr. Reeves' usual order. "Sometimes it might be about feeling underappreciated, but it could also involve financial pressures, ideological disagreements, or personal grudges against specific individuals or policies. Understanding those motivations is probably crucial for preventing future breaches." Dr. Reeves nodded thoughtfully, clearly filing away. Elena's analysis for some future academic discussion about security psychology and organizational behavior. Elena realized that her response had probably been more sophisticated than Dr. Reeves expected from a coffee shop employee, but the professor seemed to attribute Elena's insights to her military background rather than questioning how she had developed such detailed understanding of intelligence operations. The morning rush brought its usual mix of downtown professionals, all of whom seemed unusually engaged with the breaking news story about the intelligence breach. Elena found herself serving coffee to lawyers, accountants, and business executives who were all discussing the implications of the security failure for national defense and international relations. The conversations provided her with civilian perspectives on the crisis while highlighting how little the general public understood about the actual nature of intelligence work. Richard Hawthorne, the senior law partner who enjoyed testing Elena's knowledge during his regular visits, arrived with obvious excitement about the opportunity to discuss a major news story with someone who had military experience. Elena could see that he was preparing to launch into one of his characteristic intellectual challenges, probably hoping to explore her understanding of legal and constitutional issues related to classified information and national security. Elena, I'm curious about your perspective on this intelligence situation. Richard began while Elena prepared his usual espresso. From a legal standpoint, the unauthorized disclosure of classified information represents multiple federal crimes. But there's also the question of whether institutional failures contributed to creating conditions where such breaches become possible. Do you think the military's classification system is fundamentally sound, or does it create vulnerabilities through overclassification and poor security practices? The question touched directly on issues that Elena had wrestled with throughout her military career, particularly during missions where security protocols sometimes conflicted with operational effectiveness. Her experience had taught her that classification systems served important purposes, but could also create blind spots and communication barriers that hindered mission success. However, discussing those insights would require revealing knowledge that came from classified experience rather than general military service. I think classification systems probably reflect a balance between protecting sensitive information and allowing people to do their jobs effectively. Elena answered diplomatically. But you're right that overclassification can create problems, especially when people can't share information that might be crucial for preventing security breaches or operational failures. Finding the right balance is probably one of the most challenging aspects of intelligence work. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly at Elena's nuanced analysis, clearly surprised by her sophisticated understanding of classification issues and their practical implications. Elena could see him reassessing his assumptions about her background and education, but she also knew that any follow-up questions would lead to areas where she couldn't provide specific details without revealing classified information. The developing news story continued to dominate conversations throughout the morning, with customers speculating about the identity of the person or persons responsible for the breach and the potential consequences for national security. Elena found herself in the surreal position of listening to public analysis of a situation where she might soon be actively involved in the investigation, while maintaining her cover as someone whose only connection to the military was general service experience. Sarah Chun, the financial advisor who had become a regular customer, arrived later than usual with her tablet displaying multiple news websites covering the intelligence story. Elena could see that Sarah was particularly interested in the potential economic implications of the security breach, probably analyzing how defense industry stocks might be affected by revelations about intelligence vulnerabilities. Elena, I've been thinking about our conversation last week regarding career opportunities in government and defense work, Sarah said while reviewing market data on her tablet. This intelligence situation is probably going to create demand for people with security expertise and military backgrounds. Companies that do government contracting are going to need additional personnel to help shore up their security protocols. Have you considered whether this might create openings for someone with your qualifications? The suggestion was astute and well-timed, but Elena knew that her actual qualifications in intelligence and security work couldn't be documented or discussed through normal employment channels. The positions that would best utilize her skills were precisely the ones she couldn't pursue without revealing information that remained classified. The current crisis might indeed create opportunities, but accessing them would require navigating the same security protocols that had complicated her civilian job search. That's an interesting perspective, Elena replied while refilling Sarah's coffee. I imagine the situation is creating a lot of pressure on organizations to review their security practices and make sure they have qualified people in critical positions. But government security work can be pretty competitive, especially for people whose military experience might not translate directly to documented qualifications. Sarah nodded sympathetically, understanding the general challenges that veterans faced in transitioning their military experience to civilian careers, but not realizing that Elena's situation was complicated by factors that went far beyond the usual difficulties of military to civilian translation. The financial advisor's advice was based on observing Elena's analytical thinking and professional demeanor, but it didn't account for the classification restrictions that governed Elena's actual qualifications and experience. Kevin Park, the graduate student in international relations, arrived during the afternoon lull with obvious excitement about the opportunity to discuss a major intelligence story with someone who had military experience. Elena could see that he was viewing the situation as a real-world case study that might provide insights for his thesis research on intelligence sharing and security protocols. Elena, this intelligence breach story is exactly the kind of thing I've been studying for my thesis, Kevin said while Elena prepared his usual order. I'm particularly interested in how these kinds of security failures affect trust between allied nations and whether they lead to changes in information sharing protocols. Do you think this breach will have long-term consequences for international intelligence cooperation? The question touched on issues that Elena understood from personal experience with international operations and allied coordination, but discussing those insights would require revealing knowledge that came from classified work rather than academic study. She found herself in the familiar position of having valuable information that couldn't be shared openly, leading to frustratingly general responses to questions where she could have provided detailed, authoritative analysis. I think major security breaches probably do affect trust between allied nations, Elena replied carefully, but intelligence agencies also understand that cooperation is essential for addressing shared threats. They probably have contingency plans for dealing with compromised information and rebuilding secure communication channels. The challenge is balancing the need for security with the operational requirements for effective cooperation. Kevin nodded thoughtfully, clearly impressed by Elena's sophisticated analysis, but not realizing that her insights came from operational experience rather than academic study. Elena could see that he was mentally incorporating her comments into his thesis research, not knowing that he was receiving guidance from someone who had actually worked within the systems he was studying. The afternoon news brought additional details about the investigation, including confirmation that multiple agencies were coordinating response efforts and that several allied nations had been briefed about potential threats to their personnel. Elena watched the coverage while serving customers, noting the careful language used by officials who were trying to convey the seriousness of the situation without revealing operational details that could compromise ongoing security efforts. Elena's secure phone remained silent throughout the day, but she knew that Rebecca was probably coordinating with other agencies and preparing detailed briefing materials for the mission that Elena hadn't yet agreed to join. The 48-hour deadline was approaching, and Elena needed to make a decision about whether to resume active involvement in the classified world that she had worked so hard to leave behind. The conversation with Dr. Reeves about psychological motivations for intelligence breaches had highlighted uncomfortable parallels between Elena's own situation and the factors that might drive someone to betray classified information. Elena hadn't felt undervalued during her military service, but her subsequent civilian experience had involved systematic dismissal of her capabilities and expertise. The contrast between her current underemployment and the urgent need for her skills in the developing crisis illustrated the institutional blindness that Dr. Reeves had identified as a contributing factor to COPCO security problems. As Elena prepared to close the cafe and return to her apartment for the evening, she realized that the day's conversations had provided her with civilian perspectives on the crisis while reinforcing her understanding of how little the general public knew about the actual nature of intelligence work. The customers who had discussed the situation with such confidence and authority were operating with incomplete information and fundamental misunderstandings about how classification systems worked and why they were necessary. The developing story represented both opportunity and threat to everything Elena had tried to build since leaving active duty, but it also offered the possibility of returning to work that utilized her actual capabilities and contributed to meaningful objectives. The decision she faced wasn't just about professional opportunity. It was about identity and the fundamental question of whether her attempts to build a civilian life had been realistic given the unique nature of her background and expertise. The Phoenix Intelligence Operations Center sat inconspicuously among the sprawling office complexes near Sky Harbor Airport, its bland exterior giving no indication of the classified activities conducted within its heavily secured walls. Elena approached the facility with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, her civilian clothes feeling somehow inappropriate for returning to an environment where her actual qualifications and expertise would finally be recognized and utilized. The decision to accept Rebecca's mission had crystallized during a sleepless night spent weighing the risks and benefits of resuming active involvement in intelligence operations. The security checkpoint process felt both familiar and strange. As Elena submitted to biometric scanning and identity verification procedures that confirmed her clearance status and authorized access to classified areas, the security personnel treated her with professional courtesy that contrasted sharply with the dismissive attitudes she had encountered at the VA office and during civilian job interviews. Here, her credentials were real, documented, and respected, creating an immediate sense of professional validation that she hadn't experienced since leaving active duty. Colonel Michael Rodriguez, the commanding officer of the Joint Task Force investigating the intelligence breach, greeted Elena in a secure conference room lined with monitors displaying classified information about the developing crisis. Rodriguez was a career intelligence officer whose reputation for analytical precision and operational effectiveness had made him the natural choice to lead such a sensitive investigation. His briefing materials covered multiple tables, indicating the scope and complexity of the situation that Elena was being asked to help resolve. Sergeant Vasquez, thank you for agreeing to participate in this investigation, Rodriguez began, using Elena's military rank and surname in a way that immediately restored her professional identity. Your expertise with the compromised identification systems is crucial to understanding how this breach occurred and what information may have been exposed to hostile forces. We're dealing with a security failure that could affect ongoing operations worldwide. The formal recognition of Elena's military rank and professional status felt almost overwhelming after months of being dismissed as an underemployed veteran with poor judgment about personal appearance. Rodriguez's respectful tone and obvious reliance on her expertise created an immediate sense of belonging that contrasted dramatically with her civilian experiences. She found herself straightening unconsciously, her military bearing returning as she prepared to engage with work that matched her actual capabilities. The briefing room contained detailed maps of regions where Elena had conducted operations during her active duty service, with overlays showing current intelligence assets and personnel who might be at risk if the identification systems had been fully compromised. Elena recognized many of the locations and operational designations, recalling specific missions and the personnel who had been involved in gathering the intelligence that was now potentially exposed to enemy forces. "Colonel, what's our current assessment of the scope of the breach?" Elena asked, slipping naturally into the analytical mindset that had defined her most successful military assignments. "Are we looking at a complete compromise of the identification systems, or do we believe the exposure is limited to specific operational areas or time periods?" Rodriguez consulted his classified notes before responding, his expression indicating that the situation was even more serious than the public news coverage had suggested. "Our preliminary assessment indicates that hostile forces have gained access to identification protocols used across multiple operational areas between 2019 and 2022. This includes the symbolic recognition systems, geographic encoding methods, and personnel identification markers that were used during your deployment period." The time frame Rodriguez mentioned encompassed Elena's most sensitive assignments, including operations that had required her to work under deep cover in hostile territories where traditional identification methods would have compromised her safety and effectiveness. If enemy forces had gained access to information about those systems, current personnel operating in similar circumstances could be in immediate danger, and the networks they had developed might be compromised beyond recovery. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena's mind automatically began analyzing the tactical implications and potential response strategies that the FAS situation would require. Her knowledge of the identification systems was comprehensive, gained through years of operational use and specialized training in their application under various circumstances. She understood not only how the systems worked, but also their vulnerabilities, and the methods that hostile forces might use to exploit compromised information. "Sir, if the symbolic recognition protocols have been compromised, we need to assume that any personnel currently using those systems are at risk," Elena said, her tactical training automatically focusing on the immediate threat to operational security. "Have we initiated emergency extraction procedures for personnel who might be exposed? And are we implementing new identification protocols to replace the compromised systems?" Rodriguez nodded grimly, confirming that emergency procedures were already underway, but highlighting the complexity of protecting personnel whose safety depended on identification systems that could no longer be trusted. "We've initiated protective measures for personnel in high-risk areas, but the scope of the breach means we're dealing with hundreds of assets across multiple theaters of operation. Replacing the identification systems will take months, and we need to understand exactly what information was compromised before we can design effective replacements." The magnitude of the crisis was becoming clearer as Elena processed the implications of Rodriguez's briefing. The identification systems that had been compromised represented years of development and testing, incorporating lessons learned from operational experience in some of the world's most dangerous regions. Rebuilding those capabilities would require extensive resources and time that might not be available if the security situation continued to deteriorate. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the task force's intelligence analyst, joined the briefing with additional classified materials that detailed the specific nature of the suspected breach. Dr. Mitchell was a civilian contractor with extensive experience in intelligence security and counterintelligence operations. Her academic credentials complemented by practical experience in investigating and preventing security violations. Her analysis would be crucial to understanding how the breach had occurred and what steps would be necessary to prevent similar failures in the future. Sergeant Vasquez, we believe the breach originated from someone with detailed knowledge of the identification systems and access to the encoding protocols that govern their operation. Dr. Mitchell explained while distributing classified documents that Elena recognized as technical specifications for systems she had used extensively during her operational assignments. The level of detail in the compromised information suggests neither a highly placed insider or a sophisticated penetration of our security infrastructure. Elena reviewed the technical documents with growing concern as she recognized specific protocols and encoding methods that had been central to her most sensitive missions. The compromised information included not just general descriptions of how the identification systems worked, but detailed specifications that would allow hostile forces to decode the symbolic markers and understand their operational significance. If enemy agents had access to this level of detail, Elena's own tattoos could become liabilities rather than assets. Major David Park, the task force's operational security specialist, provided additional context about the investigation's scope and the resources being devoted to resolving the crisis. Major Park had extensive experience in counterintelligence operations and security breach investigations. His expertise crucial to identifying the source of the leak and implementing measures to prevent additional compromises. His assessment would determine the investigative approach and the specific roles that different team members would play in the operation. Our investigation is focusing on personnel who had access to the compromised systems during the relevant time period, Major Park explained while displaying organizational charts that showed the clearance levels and access permissions for various military and civilian personnel. We're conducting detailed background reviews and security interviews with everyone who had knowledge of the identification protocols, looking for indicators of compromise or vulnerability that might explain how this information reached hostile forces. Elena realized that her own background would inevitably be scrutinized as part of the investigation, given her extensive knowledge of the compromised systems and her current civilian status that might make her appear vulnerable to recruitment by hostile intelligence services. The irony wasn't lost on her that accepting the mission to investigate the security breach would require submitting to investigation herself, potentially exposing her personal circumstances and civilian relationships to official scrutiny. The briefing materials included photographs and biographical information about suspected hostile agents who might be involved in exploiting the compromised intelligence. Elena recognized several of the individuals from her operational experience, particularly those associated with the network she had helped identify during Operation Silent Dawn. Seeing their faces again brought back memories of the dangerous and complex missions that had defined her most significant military achievements. While highlighting the ongoing nature of the threats they represented, Agent Lisa Wong from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division joined the team briefing to discuss the domestic aspects of the investigation, including the possibility that the breach involved use-based personnel or facilities. Agent Wong's expertise in investigating espionage cases and security violations would be essential to understanding whether the compromise had occurred through traditional espionage methods or through more sophisticated cyber intrusions that might have targeted classified networks and databases. We're coordinating with multiple agencies to trace the origins of the leaked information and identify any domestic connections that might be involved. Agent Wong explained while displaying flowcharts that showed the complex relationships between different intelligence agencies and their shared information systems. The scope of the breach suggests that whoever is responsible had access to information from multiple sources, possibly indicating a coordinated effort involving several compromised individuals or a systematic penetration of our security infrastructure. The multi-agency nature of the investigation highlighted the seriousness with which the intelligence community was treating the breach. but it also indicated the complexity of coordinating response efforts across different organizations with varying priorities and operational procedures. Elena's role in the investigation would require her to work effectively with personnel from different agencies, while maintaining the security protocols that governed her own classified background and current civilian cover. As the initial briefing concluded, Elena found herself assigned to a specialized team responsible for analyzing the technical aspects of the compromised identification systems and developing recommendations for enhanced security measures. Her expertise would be crucial to understanding exactly how the systems had been penetrated and what modifications would be necessary to prevent similar breaches in the future. The work would require her to draw on her operational experience while contributing to defensive measures that could protect future personnel and operations. The transition from coffee shop employee to active intelligence operative felt almost surreal, as Elena was provided with temporary office space, security credentials, and access to classified networks that connected her to the broader intelligence community. Her civilian concerns about employment and professional recognition seemed almost trivial compared to the national security implications of the current crisis. But she also understood that the mission represented an opportunity to demonstrate the value of capabilities that had been systematically overlooked and underutilized. Elena's first assignment involved reviewing classified databases to identify patterns in the compromised information and develop hypotheses about how the breach might have occurred. The work required her to analyze technical specifications, operational reports, and security protocols while looking for vulnerabilities that hostile forces might have exploited. Her operational experience provided context that pure analysts might miss, allowing her to understand not just how the systems worked, but how they had been used in real-world situations where security and effectiveness had to be balanced against operational requirements. The secure facilities environment felt both familiar and foreign as Elena settled into work that utilized her actual qualifications while requiring her to maintain awareness of the civilian cover that she would need to preserve once the mission concluded. The classified nature of her assignment meant that she couldn't discuss her work with Sarah, Jessica, or any of the other people who had become important to her civilian life, creating a sense of professional isolation that reminded her of the challenges she had faced during her original transition from military to civilian employment. As Elena began her analysis of the compromised identification systems, she realized that the investigation would require her to confront not just the technical aspects of the security breach, but also the institutional assumptions and practices that might have contributed to creating vulnerabilities in the first place. Her unique perspective as someone who had experienced both the classified world and civilian dismissal of unconventional approaches might provide insights that traditional investigators would miss, potentially leading to recommendations that could improve security while preserving operational effectiveness. The work ahead would test Elena's ability to balance her commitment to national security with her desire to protect the civilian relationships and identity she had worked to build, while potentially providing the professional recognition and meaningful work that had been missing from her post-military life. Success in the mission could reshape her career prospects and restore her sense of professional purpose, but failure could result in exposure of her cover and potential endangerment of everyone who had become part of her civilian world. Elena stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of her shared apartment, knowing that the next few hours would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her life in ways that couldn't be undone or easily explained to the people who had become important to her civilian existence. The secure phone in her bedroom contained final confirmation of her assignment details, operational protocols, and a cover story she would need to maintain while balancing classified work with her public identity as an underemployed coffee shop worker. The weight of returning to intelligence operations felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Elena emerged from the bathroom. Her nursing textbook spread across the counter as she reviewed material for an upcoming clinical rotation. The normalcy of the scene felt almost surreal given the classified mission that Elena was about to undertake, creating a stark contrast between her roommate's straightforward academic challenges and the complex web of deception that Elena would need to navigate in the coming weeks. "You seem really tense lately," Sarah observed while reviewing her notes on cardiac procedures. "I know the job search has been frustrating, but you've been acting like you're carrying some kind of major stress that you can't talk about. Is everything okay with your family? You've been getting a lot of phone calls in the evenings, and you always take them in your room with the door closed." Elena felt a pang of guilt about the deception she was practicing with someone who had shown her genuine friendship and support during the difficult months of civilian transition. Sarah's concern was based on her observation of behavioral changes that Elena couldn't explain without revealing information that would violate security protocols and potentially endanger both of them. The caring nature of Sarah's inquiry made the necessary dishonesty even more painful. "I've been dealing with some complicated family issues that I can't really discuss," Elena replied, using the cover story that had been developed to explain any unusual behavior or scheduling irregularities that might arise during the mission. "My cousin in California is going through a difficult divorce, and she's been calling for support. I'm also exploring some new job opportunities that require a lot of phone interviews and preliminary discussions." The explanation was plausible and contained enough truth to satisfy Sarah's immediate curiosity while providing cover for the secure communications and irregular schedule that Elena's assignment would require. Elena had practiced the story until it felt natural, but delivering it to someone who trusted her completely still felt like a betrayal of the authentic relationship they had developed. Sarah nodded sympathetically, accepting Elena's explanation without suspicion while expressing the kind of supportive concern that made Elena's deception even more difficult to maintain. "If you need to adjust your schedule or take time off for family issues, just let me know. I can cover your share of the utilities if money gets tight, and I'm always here if you need someone to talk to about whatever's going on." The generous offer highlighted the fundamental decency of Elena's civilian relationships, while emphasizing the potential consequences of her classified work were discovered by people who had welcomed her into their lives based on incomplete and carefully constructed information. Elena's cover identity had been built on truthful details about her military service and current circumstances, but it omitted the most significant aspects of her background and capabilities. Elena's morning shift at Desert Bloom Cafe required her to maintain normal interactions with customers and coworkers while managing the cognitive load of operational planning and security awareness that would govern her classified assignment. The familiar routine of preparing coffee and serving pastries felt like performance art as she went through the motions of civilian employment while her mind processed briefing materials and tactical considerations that her colleagues couldn't. Imagine, Jessica Martinez arrived early for her shift with obvious excitement about a new art project that involved documenting tattoo culture in urban environments. Elena watched her coworkers' enthusiasm while recognizing the irony that Jessica was studying artistic expression without understanding that Elena's own tattoos represented some of the most sophisticated examples of coded artwork ever created by military intelligence specialists. "Elena, I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to participate in my thesis project," Jessica said while organizing supplies behind the counter. "I'm documenting different approaches to tattoo composition and the stories behind people's artistic choices. Your pieces are so technically sophisticated and obviously meaningful to you. Would you be comfortable being interviewed about your artistic journey and the significance of your designs?" The request represented exactly the kind of attention that Elena needed to avoid while conducting classified operations, but refusing would require explanations that might create suspicion or hurt Jessica's feelings. Elena found herself navigating between personal relationships and operational security requirements, a balance that would become increasingly difficult to maintain as her assignment progressed. "I'm flattered that you want to include my work in your project," Elena replied carefully, "but I'm pretty private about the personal stories behind my tattoos. They represent some very personal experiences that I'm not ready to discuss publicly. Maybe we could focus on the artistic techniques instead of the biographical aspects." Jessica's disappointment was visible, but she accepted Elena's boundaries with the respect that characterized their friendship. Elena realized that her refusal might actually strengthen her cover by reinforcing the impression that her tattoos were personal rather than professional. But the interaction highlighted the ongoing challenge of maintaining authentic relationships while protecting classified information. Marcus Thompson began the morning shift with unusual energy, clearly motivated by his interpretation of the developing intelligence crisis as validation of his views about military professionalism and security consciousness. Elena listened to his commentary while recognizing that he was discussing a situation where she would soon be playing an active investigative role, creating another layer of cognitive dissonance between her public and classified identities. "This intelligence breach situation proves what I've been saying about maintaining proper military standards," Marcus announced while reviewing the day's inventory. "When people start cutting corners on discipline and professional appearance, it creates a culture where security violations become acceptable. I guarantee you that whoever compromised this classified information was someone who never learned proper respect for military protocol." Elena bit her tongue to avoid responding that the most serious intelligence breaches were typically committed by personnel with exemplary service records who had been trusted with the highest levels of access, not by people with visible tattoos or unconventional appearances. Marcus's analysis reflected the same institutional biases that had led to Elena's systematic underestimation, while missing the complex factors that actually contributed to security vulnerabilities. The morning coffee rush brought its usual mix of downtown professionals, many of whom continued to discuss the intelligence crisis with the confident authority of people whose understanding was based on sanitized news coverage rather than classified briefings. Elena found herself serving coffee to lawyers and business executives who were speculating about investigation methods and security measures while she prepared to participate in the actual classified response to the situation they were discussing. Richard Hawthorne arrived with his usual intellectual curiosity, clearly eager to continue his ongoing effort to understand Elena's background and capabilities through increasingly sophisticated conversational challenges. Elena could see that the lawyer was particularly interested in exploring her knowledge of the intelligence situation, probably hoping to assess whether her military experience provided insights that weren't available through public sources. "Elena, I've been following the development of this intelligence story, and I'm curious about your perspective on the investigative challenges involved," Richard said while Elena prepared his espresso. "From a legal standpoint, these kinds of security breach cases require coordination between multiple agencies with different jurisdictions and authorities. Do you think the military justice system is equipped to handle complex investigations that might involve civilian contractors and international intelligence sharing?" The question touched directly on issues that Elena was about to address through her classified assignment, creating the uncomfortable situation of being asked to speculate about processes that she would soon be experiencing firsthand. Her response would need to demonstrate appropriate knowledge while avoiding any indication that she might have more than general familiarity with intelligence investigation procedures. "I think these kinds of complex cases probably do create challenges for coordination between different agencies," Elena replied diplomatically. "Military justice and civilian law enforcement have different priorities and procedures, so they probably need special protocols for handling investigations that cross those boundaries. The classification requirements alone must make evidence Sharing and prosecution planning pretty complicated. Richard nodded thoughtfully, clearly impressed by Elena's analytical approach, but not realizing that her insights were based on preliminary briefings for an active investigation rather than general knowledge or speculation. Elena could see him filing away her observations for future reference, possibly planning to test her understanding with additional questions during subsequent visits. Dr. Patricia Reeves arrived for her Tuesday appointment with obvious excitement about the opportunity to analyze the psychological aspects of the intelligence crisis, clearly viewing the situation as a real-world case study that validated her academic research on institutional psychology and security behavior. Elena prepared herself for another challenging conversation, where she would need to demonstrate appropriate expertise while concealing her actual involvement in the developing situation. Elena, I've been thinking about our previous conversation regarding the psychological motivations for intelligence breaches, Dr. Reeves announced while settling into her corner table. This current situation seems to validate my hypothesis that security violations often result from institutional failures that create resentment and alienation among personnel with access to sensitive information. Do you think the military's emphasis on conformity and hierarchy might contribute to these kinds of betrayals? The question was particularly uncomfortable given Elena's own experience of institutional dismissal and the opportunity for meaningful work that had motivated her decision to accept the classified assignment. Elena found herself being asked to analyze psychological factors that might apply to her own situation, while concealing that she was about to become an active participant in investigating exactly the kind of security breach that Dr. Reeves was discussing. I think institutional culture probably does play a role in security issues, Elena answered carefully, but the motivations for betraying classified information are probably pretty individual and complex. Some people might act out of resentment, but others might be motivated by money, ideology, or personal relationships. Understanding those different factors is probably important for preventing future security problems. Dr. Reeves nodded approvingly, clearly satisfied with Elena's sophisticated analysis while remaining unaware that she was receiving insights from someone who would soon be investigating the actual psychological and institutional factors that had contributed to the current crisis. Elena realized that her conversations with civilian customers were providing valuable perspective on public understanding of intelligence issues, but they were also creating additional pressure to maintain her cover while managing the cognitive demands of classified work. Elena's lunch break provided an opportunity to review secure communications and finalize preparations for the operational phase of her assignment, which would begin that afternoon with detailed analysis of the compromised identification systems. The transition from customer service to classified intelligence work would require careful time management and continued maintenance of her civilian routine to avoid creating suspicious patterns in her behavior or schedule. The secure facility where Elena would conduct her classified work was located less than 20 minutes from the coffee shop, allowing her to maintain her cover employment while participating in the investigation. The proximity was convenient for operational purposes, but it also meant that her two professional identities would exist in uncomfortably close physical proximity, increasing the risk of accidental exposure or behavioral inconsistencies that might compromise her cover. Elena's phone contained carefully encrypted messages with tactical updates and operational guidance that would govern her approach to the investigation, but she couldn't review these materials until she reached the secure environment where such communications were authorized. The mental compartmentalization required to separate classified and unclassified information was a skill she had developed during her military service, but applying it to civilian relationships and everyday interactions created new challenges that tested her ability to maintain authentic connections while protecting national security information. As Elena prepared to leave the cafe for her first operational session, She realized that she was crossing a threshold that couldn't be easily reversed. The decision to accept the classified assignment represented more than professional opportunity. It was a fundamental choice about identity and the direction of her future. Success in the mission might lead to renewed intelligence career with proper recognition of her capabilities, but it would also require permanent management of the deception that separated her public identity from her actual qualifications and experience. The balance between personal relationships and professional obligations that Elena was about to navigate would test her ability to maintain the civilian connections that had provided stability and meaning during her difficult transition from military service. The people who had welcomed her into their lives based on incomplete information about her background deserved better than the systematic deception that her classified work would require. But the national security implications of the current crisis made those ethical considerations secondary to operational requirements. Elena's reflection in the cafe's window showed someone who appeared to be exactly what she claimed to be, an underemployed veteran working in customer service while searching for better opportunities. The image was accurate in its details, but incomplete in its implications, representing a carefully constructed identity that would soon be tested by the demands of classified work and the ongoing challenge of protecting both national security and personal relationships in a world where truth was a luxury that few people in her position could afford. 3 weeks later, Elena was cleaning espresso equipment during the afternoon lull when a man in a crisp military uniform walked through the cafe door. She looked up and her blood froze. 4-star General Patricia Morrison, the highest-ranking intelligence officer in the United States military, was scanning the room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to assessing threats and opportunities. Elena's hands trembled as she continued her routine tasks, hoping against hope that the general was simply stopping for coffee during a layover at nearby Sky Harbor Airport. But Morrison's gaze settled on Elena with unmistakable recognition, and she approached the counter with the purposeful stride of someone conducting official business. "Elena Vasquez," General Morrison said quietly, her voice carrying authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone within earshot. "I need to speak with you immediately." The cafe fell silent as customers and employees processed the surreal scene of a 4-star general addressing their tattooed barista by name. Elena felt her carefully constructed civilian identity crumbling in real time as Marcus, Jessica, and several regular customers stared in confusion and growing curiosity. "Ma'am, I think there might be some mistake," Elena began, attempting to maintain her cover despite the obvious futility of the effort. "General." Morrison's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Sergeant, the mission is complete. We've identified and arrested the individual responsible for the intelligence breach. Your analysis of the coded identification systems was instrumental in breaking the case." Jessica gasped audibly as the implications of the general's words began to sink in. "Elena, what is she talking about? What coded identification systems?" General Morrison turned to address the confused audience that had gathered around them. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've been working alongside one of the most decorated intelligence operatives in U.S. military history. Sergeant Vasquez's seemingly decorative tattoos are actually sophisticated, coded records of classified operations that help prevent terrorist attacks and save allied personnel in hostile territories." Elena watched in amazement as the general began explaining the true significance of her body art to the people who had dismissed it as unprofessional decoration. The vine patterns on her neck contain geographic coordinates for successful intelligence operations. The geometric designs on her hands represent classified projects that contributed to international security. Even the small animals hidden in her artwork carry operational significance that most people could never recognize or understand. Marcus Thompson's face went through a series of expressions as he processed the revelation that the employee he had lectured about military Professionalism was actually a highly decorated operative whose service record far exceeded his own. Elena, is this true? Are you really some kind of secret agent? Former secret agent, Elena corrected with a small smile. I've been trying to transition to civilian life, but apparently my expertise was still needed for one more mission. Dr. Patricia Reeves, who had been conducting her weekly analysis of Elena's psychological motivations, stared in obvious shock at the realization that her amateur psychoanalysis had been directed at someone whose actual background invalidated every assumption she had made. I don't understand. If you're so highly qualified, why were you working in a coffee shop? General Morrison answered before Elena could respond. Because the classification restrictions governing her service made it impossible to document her actual qualifications through normal employment channels. Sergeant Vasquez's contributions to national security couldn't be discussed or used as job credentials without compromising ongoing operations and the safety of personnel still serving in classified capacities. Richard Hawthorne, the lawyer who had been testing Elena's intelligence through increasingly complex conversations, began laughing with obvious admiration. I knew there was something extraordinary about your analytical capabilities. I kept trying to figure out how a coffee shop employee had such sophisticated understanding of international affairs and legal complexities. Elena looked around the cafe at the faces of people who had formed opinions about her based on incomplete information, watching as their assumptions were systematically dismantled by the revelation of her true background. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same appearance that had led to systematic underestimation had actually been official recognition of achievements that most people could never understand or appreciate. So what happens now? Jessica asked, her artistic appreciation for Elena's tattoos taking on entirely new significance as she understood their true purpose. General, Morrison smiled as she prepared to deliver the news that would reshape Elena's future. Sergeant Vasquez has been offered a position with the new Intelligence Integration Task Force, where her expertise in unconventional operations and coded identification systems will be used to train the next generation of intelligence professionals. Her unique perspective on how institutional assumptions can blind us to exceptional capabilities will help ensure that we never again overlook talented personnel because they don't fit conventional expectations. Elena felt tears forming as she realized that her struggle to find meaningful work that honored her actual qualifications was finally over. The job offer represented more than professional opportunity. It was institutional recognition that appearance and convention were less important than capability and results. I accept, Elena said simply, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had finally found her place in the world. As applause erupted from the customers and employees who had unknowingly befriended one of America's most accomplished intelligence operatives. Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from dismissal and underemployment to renewed purpose and recognition. Sometimes, the most powerful people are hiding in plain sight, dismissed by those who judge capability by appearance rather than results. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the one who can solve the impossible problem. If this story inspired you to look beyond surface assumptions and recognize hidden potential in unexpected places, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe extraordinary capabilities can be found where others least expect them. Share your own stories in the comments about times when someone surprised you by exceeding every expectation. And remember to ring that notification bell, because the most amazing stories of hidden talent and triumph over prejudice are being written every single day.